hour read or so. If I could do it a little quick, it's about 8 pages, 16. It'll be about 16 pages front and back. 8 pages front and back, 16 altogether. Holy. Anyway, we're almost done with the book, man. We are almost done with the book where we only have 3 chapters left. 3 chapters and the afterward. 3 chapters and the afterward left. And while I'm up, I was like, hey, let's go ahead and get it in. All right. Whoever you are on, shalom, shalom. Welcome. So let's get section 3 started. Section 3 of chapter 9, the theater owners and the Apollo Theater. Let's see what the full name is. Theater owners, booking association, and the Apollo Theater. Changing the joke and slipping the yoke, man. It's chapter 9, section 3. Maybe y'all, if y'all up with me, come on in, man. Say what's up in the comments, man. Leave a like. Let's get it in. With the closing of many on the TOBA circuit, urban theaters in the North assumed even more importance for Black performers. And Harlem, already the mecca of Black America and entertainment, became even more imminent. Naturally, the struggle for control of this potentially rich enterprise was intense, but by the mid-30s, Frank Skiffman and the Apollo Theater had emerged as the pinnacle of Black variety entertainment on stage. I didn't realize that's what it was, a variety show. The Apollo, however, was not initially Harlem's premier showcase. There were nearly a dozen theaters in Harlem during the teens, most of which did not admit Blacks. And the major theaters on 7th Avenue and 125th Street were for whites only. The Crescent and Lincoln, both on 135th Street between Lenox and 5th Avenues, and later Lafayette at 7th Avenue and 132nd Street, allowed Black patrons. By the 20s, as the so-called Black Belt spread, theaters such as the Alhambra opened their balconies to Black patrons, but continued reserving the orchestra section for the whites. The Lafayette was the first of Harlem's major showplaces to allow Blacks unrestricted access. Even as the other theaters relaxed their policies, the Lafayette, called the Uptown Palace, remained Harlem's most prestigious showplace during the 20s. At first, it offered a wide variety of entertainment, including productions of classic plays by Shakespeare and others that featured the Lafayette Players, a Black troupe headed by the famed actor Charles Gilpin. It also featured headline performers such as Bill Robinson, Louis Armstrong, and Buck and Bubbles. Now, when Frank Skiffman and Leo Brecher took over in 1925, they began presenting vaudeville-like stage shows with chorus girls, orchestra, and variety acts. Despite protests by Blacks who wanted a serious, legitimate theater, the shows were a popular success. Now, Skiffman, I think it's Skiffman would eventually use the new format at the Apollo, but first, he faced some tough competition from the unexpected source. Known as a shrewd, ferocious businessman, Skiffman had driven out several competitors, including the Alhambra by 1931. When newly elected mayor Fiorello LaGuardia began pressuring owners to close burlesque houses in 1933, several of the 125th Street burlesque and variety houses were forced out of business. In July of 1934, however, Apollo Theater Sidney Cohen and Morris Sussman opened the original 125th Street Apollo Theater in what had been Herting and Siemens Burlesque. They promised the finest theater in Harlem. And the new theater located on Harlem's central thoroughfare between 7th and 8th Avenues quickly cut out the Lafayette's profits. Now, in June, Skiffman responded House by moving his operation from 132nd Street to the Harlem's Opera House, also on 125th Street. Now, after nearly a year-long battle involving machinists worthy of international espionage, the owners realized that they were cutting their own throats. Two theaters presenting essentially the same entertainment, often the same performers on alternate weeks, could not function profitably within the stone throws of each other. A deal was made. The theaters merged, and in May of 1935, Frank Skiffman emerged as the manager and half owner of the Apollo Theater, which changed its billing to the on-stage show in Harlem. Now, Skiffman was a controversial figure in black entertainment, admired and respected by some, scorned and exonerated by others. He was rarely viewed neutrally. His Machiavellian approach to business is a matter of record, and most would admit that he was an unrepentant shark in business matters. He quickly eliminated his competitors and for decades eradicated all serious competition, which earned him the grudging esteem of other showmen. And among performers, however, their estate or the estimate was not glowing. Of his knowledge of black acts, John Bubble said, only thing he knew was how to get people as cheap as he could and work them as long as he could. And John Hammond, a record producer and friend, flatly declared Frank had no artistic taste at all. And even so, with ironclad control and his hands-on approach that had him personally evaluate nearly every act that played in the theater, he fashioned what even his detractors admit was the most illustrious showplace for black entertainment ever to arise in Harlem or any other place. The early Apollo shows were vaudeville or variety presentations with big bands, a choir line, comedians, dancers, and featured acts including all of the top performers of the era. Now, Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, Count Basie, Louis Armstrong, and Stephen Fetching, Bessie Smith, Fats Waller, Lena Horne, Bill Robinson, Noble Sissle, Ella Fitzgerald, and more. The Apollo Theater Amateur Night, which included renowned early successes such as Ella Fitzgerald and Billy Eckstine, and later curious failures such as Roy Hamilton and Luther Vandross, who was booed off the stage. One wonders whether the audience was not wearing blackface on those nights, was also a key factor in the theater's popularity. Now, Ralph Cooper had inaugurated the show shortly after Cohen and Sussman opened the Apollo in 1934. Interest grew steadily, and by the time Skiffman took over the theater, Amateur Night was as much of the part of the Apollo's allure as were its big-name acts. Despite a well-publicized rift between Skiffman and Cooper, he had left Skiffman's Lafayette to join the new Apollo. Amateur Night to continue with Cooper as the MC, and in later years, Willie Bryant, Leonard Reed, and others would host this weekly extravaganza. Now, comedians were not usually featured acts during the early years, although Stephen Fetching and Pigmeat Markham did occasionally headline shows. Now, nevertheless, comedy was a persuasive element in the theater's mystique. The MCs regularly engaged in lighthearted banter with the band and performers. Willie Bryant might draw Dizzy Gillespie's into the comical exchange, or Leonard Reed might trade jives with the dancer Honey Coles. And comedians such as Miles Mableys would offer impromptu lines broke up the audience. Now, Count Basie, I sure would like to know what that drummer is doing after the show. As with all aspects of the shows, Skiffman's exerted palpable control. Now, according to Honey Coles, Skiffman wouldn't allow the word damn on the stage. If a comic came out and said damn, he'll tell them, you'll have to take that out. He'd be going downstairs and listening to rehearsals, and if something came up that he didn't like, he'd say, you can't do that. Can't do that in this theater. That was it. Hell and damn were not allowed. Now, restrictions were relaxed when Skiffman's son Bobby and Jack assumed control of the theater in later years. At the outset, however, comedy on the Apollo stage lost some of the earthiness displayed on the TOBA tour, but not enough, apparently, to satisfy the more conservative forces in the community. A Harlem journalist, concerned about the image of Negroes presented to visitors from downtown, wrote, I shudder as I think of the impression he must take back downtown with him. When the comedy remains absolutely in the sewer and seldom even rises to the level of the gutter, I wonder how many of what kind of people will the content to have it reflect their lives, thoughts, and actions to the outside world. His was, of course, a familiar complaint, one which, again, was more focused on what non blacks thought of the entertainment presented than on the actual content. It was based, perhaps justifiably, on the blackface makeup that Apollo comedians still inexplicably wore, but also quite obviously and self consciously on the assumption that for non blacks, the antics of those blackface jesters represented the real character of all blacks. What these critics ignored was that much humor, as one theorist noted, by its very nature forces us to drop the mask we have composed into the features of our decent, cautious selves, strips man of his breeches. For most middle class black observers, laughter derived from candid lampooning of the foibles of lower class black life was unacceptable. They were, after all, idealistically dedicated to eventual assimilation through uplifting the race and projecting an image of unfaltering propriety. Overcautiously monitoring the negative impression some whites may have drawn from black humor, they ignored not only the double edged irony embedded in such routines as Pig Meets Markham's Here Comes the Judge, but also the positive benefits for African American audiences. The laughter, as Henry Bergeson noted, is often distancing factor, and most blacks viewing the low, the low roostabout comedy presented on the Apollo stage no doubt experienced the transcendence or the disassociation from the object of laughter commonly resulting from such comedy. As stage comedy developed, however, even as many Apollo comics continued in the tradition of the TOBA humor, some of its more blatant buffoonery was gradually being mediated. And despite the Skiffman's uh, penchant for clean humor and black bourgeois disapproval, the Apollo audience, many of whom presumably had taken part in the riot of 1935, began demanding less veiled expression of actual black sentiments regarding the larger society. More and more often, they received it. The change occurred within a rather unique setting. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Apollo theater comedy during the 30s and 40s was its ensemble company makeup. According to Honey Coles, there were a dozen or so comedians who were, in effect, regulars. In addition to perennial favorites, Pygmy Markham, Manton Moreland, Dusty Fletcher, Tim Moore, and John Spider Bruce Mason, there were those who doubled as MCs, including Ralph Cooper, Willie Bryant, and Leonard Reed. Then there was a rift of such talent, second tier comics, and straight people as John Ashkin LaRue, Johnny Lee Long, Jimmy Basquette, Eddie Green, Sandy Burns, Wiltshire, Edna May Harris, Crackshot Hackley, Spodioti, Monty Hawley, John Rastus Moray, and Vivian Harris. All of these performers contributed to the scores of sketches and skits, many developed on the TOBA circuit, that became the hallmark of the Apollo comedy. But even as old routines were rehashed, the inbred situational skits increasingly began to take on a different tone. Although tame in comparison to the assertiveness and derisive wit heard decades later on the stand-up comedy of Dick Gregory and Richard Pryor, Apollo comedians were beginning to infuse their humor with perceptions and jokes reflecting the more aggressive mood of the depression besieged black masses. An earlier example of topical humor cited in Jack Skiffman's Harlem heyday involved Patterson and Jackson, a dance comedy team billed variously as 640 pounds of humor or 2 tons of fun. And here, instead of the usual focus of food, sex, or money, African Americans' flexibility in dealing with Southern racism is the subject of the joke. Now get on the train in Tampa, Florida, on the way to New York. Conductor came around and said, "Give me your ticket, boy." Gave him my ticket. He punched it and gave it back. He came around again in Richmond, Virginia and said, "Give me your ticket, boy." Gave him my ticket. He punched it and gave it back. In the Lincoln Tunnel, on the way to New York City, the conductor came around and said, "Give me your ticket, boy." Turned around to him and said, "Who the hell you calling boy?" Presumably, the elder Skiffman was not in attendance that night, but according to his son Jack, the bit brought roars of laughter and sometimes a standing ovation. In many instances, the show's MCs, who, unlike most of the other comedians, did address the audience directly, had the greatest opportunity to insert more pungent, socially relevant commentary. Now, some, particularly the glib Willie Bryant and later Nipsey Russell, with his trademark line, "The natives are restless," did so frequently. Even Butterbeans and Susie occasionally widened the range of their down home mockery and aimed barbs at targets broader than the facilitations of black domestic life. Now, in Ted Fox's Showtime at the Apollo, band leader Andy Kirk calls one of the Apollo, "I'm ready to go down south. I ain't going with you, Sue." "Why you ain't going with me, Butter?" "Cause there's too many ups down south." "What you mean ups, Butter?" "Well, early in the morning, you got to wake up. Then you got to go get it. Then you got to get up. Then you got to go out and on a farm. And if you didn't do the work like the boss said, the boss would beat you up." Another theme that emerged with more regularity was the prickly issue of color prejudice within the African American community. In one such instance, two comedians spy a voluptuous young woman standing with her back to both of them in the audience. They trade quips about how fine she is and how she must be either a high yaller or a high yaller, I guess a high yeller, or a tan. Their exuberance escalates and they become even more profuse in their compliments and certain that the woman is at least a tan. Now, finally, they make a wager and try to get her attention. When she turns around, they see she is black as coal, and the audience would inevitably roar with delight. The comic who most successfully and frequently combined the emerging mood and assertiveness and increased worldliness with traditional black stage motifs in the 30s and 40s was Jackie Moms Mabley. Born in North Carolina in 1897, Mabley grew up in Cleveland and, by the time she was 16, had become a stage performer. Now, although she began as a dancer and singer, she dabbled in comedy almost from the beginning. And during the 20s, while she was performing on the TOBA circuit in Dallas, Butterbeans and Susie saw her act and helped her get better billings. Now, like most TABA comics, she appeared primarily in skits with other performers at first, but Mabley was one of the earliest black comics who turned the monologue humor. By the 30s, although she was not yet billed as moms, she had begun appearing in oversized clodhoppers, tattered gingham dresses, and oddball hats, and affecting the persona of a sage, a down to earth older woman. Now, early on, she sometimes abandoned the character and in 1933 even had a minor role in the movie The Emperor Jones. She also appeared at Connie's Inn in several Broadway shows, at least one of which also starred Harlem Renaissance writer Zora Neale Hurston. Excuse me, and was a regular on the black cabaret circuit where her more ribald material was much appreciated. Essentially, however, Mabley's stage character was set. Soon she would be headlining as Moms. The journey from a $14 a week performer on the TOBA tour to top billing at the Apollo was not easy. And despite the comedian nests such as Fanny Brice, Belle Barth, Jean Stanford, and Mae West, traditionally there has been an uneasy accommodation to women in comedy. Even those women who did breach the gender line in mainstream stage comedy often had to endure public opprobrium. Let's see what that is. Let's see what opprobrium is. And we'll see if I'm pronouncing it right too. Opprobrium. 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 OPPROBR. Opprobrium. Opprobrium. Harsh criticism or censor. Had to endure public harsh criticism or public harsh opprobrium. They were regularly shunted into stereotypical roles as mannish or dumb, or as virtually harlots. On the TOBA circuit, access was not quite as difficult, but it posed similar problems. As was common on the black circuit, blues singers often engaged in a kind of extemporaneous humor involving call and response with the members of the band or full-time comedians. The riotous clips with which Fats Waller punctuates Albert Brown's rendition of That Ain't Right in the film Stormy Weather provide an example of this long-standing tradition. As a result, some of the earliest black comedians were blues singers who expanded their roles and became regulars in the comedy bits. Now, Lily Mae Glover, known as Big Mama Blues, was one of the earliest of these converts. As she recalled, I made me some red plaid overalls and bought me a white shirt at the Salvation Army. I taken those white tennis shoes and put some plaid on them, and I put the tennis on the wrong foot. Then I got in front of the looking glass and locked the door and talked to myself to say what I was going to say. There's no record of exactly what she said, but Big Mama did apparently appear as a comic in the Alio segment of some tent shows during the mid-teens. Now, women such as Sweetie Mae and Susie, who teamed with male partners, were much more successful. Now, Mabley, although she was a competent dancer and vocalist, was not the true blues singer. So while still in her 20s, she devised an offbeat gimmick that's presenting her comedy routine. She assumed the character of an elderly Earth mother. The guys provided the buffer or in, intermediary necessary to quell resistance to a woman doing a single comic routine. As she later recalled, the character was like my granny, The most beautiful woman I ever knew. She was so gentle, but she kept her children in line. Best believe that. Now, still, even though she was the first comedian or comedienne that to appear as a single on at the Apollo and played theater regularly from the 30s to the 60s, according to Jack Skiffman, the star billing was not hers until near the end of her career when she graduated to $10,000 per week. Oh, she's doing it. But Mabel's brand of suggestive, often irreverent humor had made her a favorite during the 30s. She often worked with Pygmy Barkham, Dusty Fletcher, and even Stephen Fetching in the earlier years. But she was at her best alone, with just a microphone and what one journalist described as an outfit Phyllis Diller might wear if she was black. She would do her famous shuffle, sing some comical parody of a popular song, tell stories, or just stand there and the audience would howl. The stories most often focused on some folksy experience she shared with the audience or the obsessive quest for a young man, a gambit that became her trademark. In her slow southern drawl, she often trailed off into a litany of Epicurean gratification. Let's see what that is. Epic, Epicurean, Epicurean, if that's the word. Epicurean. Epicurean. Bum, 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 bum. My bad. EPIC. EPICUREAN. In modern popular usage, and let me find the pronunciation.
Epicurean.
Epicurean. Oh yeah, I was gonna get that. Epicurean. A litany of Epicurean gratification. Fond of or adapted to luxury or indulgence in sensual pleasures. Having luxurious tastes or habits, especially in eating and drinking. Fit for the epicure. Epicurean delicacies. Epicurean. They ship me some meat. You understand what I mean? They ship me some neck bones with a whole lot of meat on it. Not like the neck bones you get up here. When they say neck bones, they mean neck bones. Nothing on them but bones. Baby, I had the meat on. I put it on with the pot of cabbage and I made some crackling bread. The crowd totally identifying with Mabel's reveries and relishing the imagined orgy of soul food with high appreciation of comforting affiliation with her audience. On stage, she could literally become the grandmother that most everyone knew at one time or another. But she could also shift abruptly, tossing a suggestive aside to a band member or returning to her riper retorts. I can't do nothing with an old man because he can't do nothing with himself. Such lines anticipated the assertive sexual humor unveiled by female stand up comics in the 80s, when comedians commonly offered retorts such as, "Why don't you come up and see me sometime? Come on, Wednesday. That's amateur night." Like Mae West Mabley comically undercut male sexual prowess at a time when such disrespect was regarded as mutinous. A woman is a woman until the day she dies. She once quipped, but a man's a man only as long as he can. Yeah, boy, that's what they say. Mabley also was one of the pioneers of social satire at the Apollo. One of her most popular stories concerned two bank robbers, one white and the other black. who killed 3 bank tellers and 2 policemen and wounded a bystander. When they are sentenced to be hanged, the white man becomes overwhelmed with terror. I don't want to be hung. I don't want to be hung, he pleads. Oh man, we done killed up all them people and you talk about you don't want to be hung? They gonna hang you. So why don't you face it like a man? The white man replied, that's easy for you to say. You're used to it. Southern racism was a frequent target of her satire. And in a monologue about the dangers of performing in the South, she quipped, now they want me to go down to New Orleans. It'll be old Orleans before I get down there. The Greyhound ain't gonna take me down there, and the Bloodhounds run me back. I'll tell you that. Another bit involved her experiences driving through the South. I was on my way down to Miami. I mean, Miami. I was riding along in my Cadillac, going through one of them little towns in South Carolina. Passed through a red light. One of them big cops come running over to me, say, hey woman, don't you know you went through a red light? I said, yeah, I know I went through a red light. Well, what did you do for that? I said, because I seen all you white folks going on the green light. I thought the red light was for us. By the 40s, she was experimenting with a bit involving telephone calls to celebrities, which would later include satiric conversations with President Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson and their families. She would also muse about her visits to the White House. And during the 50s, for example, she joked about her amity with President Eisenhower and the First Lady. I was standing on the White House lawn talking to Ike the other day. Me and him and Adam Clayton Powell and Governor Phobos and Bo Diddley and Big Mabel. I asked Ike a simple question. I said, listen, boy, her ability to move easily from folksy homilies to ribald double entendres and on the social and political satire was remarkable. Perhaps more than any of the other early Apollo comics, she foreshadowed the shift to direct social commentary and stand up comedy techniques that were defined humor by the late 50s. Along with the gradual emergence of a broader social outlook in comedy, the Apollo era witnessed the last gasp of blackface stage makeup. Now, most African Americans seemed already to have disassociated themselves from the derisive caricature presented by corked up comics. Laughing at those caricatures implied no more condemnation of self than did non black audiences' acceptance of the imbecilic antics and outlandish appearance of such mainstream comedians as the Three Stooges or Joe E. Brown. Now, moreover, there was a tradition within the black community that sanctioned and, in fact, encouraged the mocking of simple-minded or miscreant behavior. As Zora Neale Hurston points out in her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road, the reproach that's just like a nigger and the mirth generated by so-called monkey stories in which the Negro sometimes symbolized by the monkey and sometimes named outright ran off with the wrong understanding of what he had seen or heard shit were common amongst blacks in her rural southern hometown. These instances of blacks exaggerating and ridiculing the ineptitude of other blacks were puzzling and unsettling to her as a child, primarily because they were at odds with the glorifying views of Negroes so often fervently expressed by preachers and orators. Now, ultimately, Hurston realized that both impulses were legitimate expressions of the African American character. As she wrote, I could see that what looked like ridicule was really the Negro poking a little fun at himself. At the same time, just like other people, hoping and wishing he was just what the orator said he was. Now, many other blacks had come to the same conclusion. So black stage comedians insist pillaring of the foibles of Negro life was not seen as unusual or outrageous. And blackface makeup for Negro audiences probably lessened any actual racial connotations that might have been drawn, since that bizarre, lifeless mask served to create an aura of fantasy and move the stage characters outside the boundaries of real life. It might even have been interpreted in a positive manner, since the act of poking fun at oneself is universally thought to reflect a healthy skepticism about one's self importance, and in most homogeneous social situations, functions as a humanizing influence. In African societies, for instance, ridicule songs serve to chastise and curb antisocial behavior. In America, however, in America, however, with its accumulation of myths and specious theories of Anglo-Saxon superiority, self-mockery among blacks had come to signify affirmation of racial inferiority to whites and some of the black middle class. This ubiquitous shadow haunted nearly every joke Black Americans told about themselves, no matter how frivolous the intent or mild and jocular the reprimand. The natural inclination of humorous expression, which nearly always focuses on differences and contradictions, was perverted by context more than anything else. In troublesome periods like the Depression, when reality intercedes most harshly and the instinct in most communities is to draw together, humor that focuses almost exclusively on intercommunity rifts and derision begins to pale. And among African Americans, burnt cork makeup, the most visible component of black stage humor, was the most obvious point of attack. As minstrelsy declined and America's obsession with watching stage darkies, whether white or black, waned, black performers increasingly faced all black audiences. In that context, visual illusion, the fabricated image of blackness, became less important than the content and style of the comic performances. Gradually, burnt cork amused or assumed, the primarily cosmetic role that it had at the outset. Although it still may have provided an element of theatrical fantasy, it no longer functioned as a crucial visual embellishment of the loathsome stereotype, as it had in white minstrelsy. The burnt cork makeup worn by Pygmy Markham or Dusty Fletcher was less consciously distorted and repugnant than that of early Negro minstrels such as Billy Cursands and or Ernest Hogan. Even though some comedians abandoned black while working on the TOBA circuit, the practice persisted, and most comics continued corking up on the Chitlin circuit and the Apollo stage during the 30s. Its use, however, seemed more a matter of habit than an intentional symbolic gesture. For many comedians, blackface, like the sketches and skits that dominated black circuit stage humor, had become a kind of safety valve, a gimmick that distanced the performer from the performance and obscured the direct line of communication that stand up would eventually demand. And many regarded the burnt cork as no more than the theatrical device, a stage illusion with little more meaning than spotlights, sound effects, or the ludicrous costumes worn by comedians or mainstream and black circus stages. The truth, however, was that blackface had taken on a deeper psychological meaning for common black folks in the audience, as well as for the dickety or middle class Negroes who protested most uh, vociferously. Vociferously. That's a funny ass word. Vociferously. I think it has something to do with, vocally. VOCI Ferously. Vociferously. Come on, baby. Vociferously. VOCI. Vociferously.
Vociferously.
Oh man, vociferously. Vociferously. In a loud or forceful manner.
Vociferously.
Vociferously. Now, by the mid 30s, pressure to put an end to the blackface was building from organizations such as the NAACP. As protests mounted, even die-hard comedians dropped the darky facade. One of the last to do so was Pigmeat Markham, who had corked up since his stage debut as the minstrel, through his years on the TABA circuit with partner Johnny Lee Long, and on to his ensemble and single routines at the Apollo. But Markham, blackface makeup served the same purpose as the grease paint and the bulbous false nose worn by circus clowns. It not only functioned objectively as a humorous mask, but also worked subjectively to permit Markham to step outside of himself and into a stage character. He felt naked without it and was anxious about abandoning it. The story of when and how Markham was finally convinced to discard cork makeup has several versions. Now, both Ralph Cooper and Barda Ali, a promoter and manager, claimed to have been instrumental in the change and offered different versions. But what is certain is that by the mid 40s, Markham was appearing all natural, revealing a complexion that, according to some, was darker than the burnt cork. Another seasoned comic, Crackshot Hackley, continued blackening up until the early 50s and may have been the last of the popular black circuit comedians to do so. But by the time, however, few objected since it was such an obvious anomaly. African American stage humor was rapidly changing, not only cosmetically, but also in terms of its candor and its range of subjects. Now, by the late 40s, Nipsey Russell was stirring interest at the Baby Grand, which was also on 125th Street, little more than a block away from the Apollo. As MC and house comedian, he was doing a stand-up bit that eschewed dialect humor and included the comic poems that would bring him nationwide attention on the Jack Parr show. Red Fox and Slappy White had teamed up with and were presenting an act that stretched the bounds of black circuit comedy in terms of uh, top, topicality and assertiveness. They open with, I'm red, I'm white, you're kidding. Tim Rogers, who had been part of the comedy dance team called Freddie and Tim in the early 40s, abandoned the loud zoot suits that he and his partner had worn and donned the tuxedo in the mid 40s. It was the first time a black comedian appeared on stage in formal dress. And a few years later, his dignified approach to comedy and popular catchphrases, oh yeah, would enable him to crack downtown clubs and theaters. Dick Gregory, who in his 60s would revolutionize stage comedy with unbleached satirical monologues that ripped the cover off of African Americans' true feelings about racism, was still in St. Louis High School. As the skinniest kid on his block, Gregory was temporarily honing his glib retorts and piercing wit on the streets, where his hack for signifying not only kept the bullies off his back, but kept everybody else in stitches. African American stage comedies, isolation and tent shows, black cabarets, chitlin circuit theaters, and more renowned showplaces such as the Apollo was coming to an end. The late 40s and the early 50s saw a brief upsurge of mainstream interest in the classic ethnic humor developed in those close quarters. Pygmy Markham, Mom's Mabley, and few others got some abbreviated exposure. Most others were ignored, except, of course, by non black comedians. Pirating jokes or routines, a common occurrence in mainstream stage humor, was even more so prevalent when black performers materials were concerned. Now, comedians from downtown reportedly visit Apollo's midnight shows regularly, accompanied by secretaries with steno pads. And Milton Berle, of course, was known for his larcenous ways, and Pygmy Markham insisted that he remembered Burl as this little white cat hardly out of knee pants, who showed up with his scratch pad and pencil and started copying down every word I said. He also claimed that Joey Adams once met him downtown and told a bystander, "Here's a man I ought to give half my salary to. I stole my first act from him at the Apollo." And according to Stump and Stumpy, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis borrowed freely from their act and once actually offered to pay them for the material. These forays into black theaters and clubs by non black comedians belied the frequently advanced claim that black circuit comedy was too vulgar and inept for mainstream consumption. Despite its numerous critiques or its lack of exposure, the comedy developed on the stages of the TOBA and children's circuits and at the Apollo from the teens to the early 50s represents a classic era of black American humor. Perhaps the most popular and recognizable character to emerge from this era was the high spirited city slicker, usually teamed with less pretentious, more dutiful, honest straight men whose cautious approach proved more prudent. This ebullient comic staple became the centerpiece of black stage comedy. On the TOBA and Chitlin circuits and at the Apollo Theater, its most riotous interpreters were Tim Moore, who later brought the character to television as Kingfish, John Mason, and Pygmy Markham. With subtle variations, each put their distinctive comedic stamp on the type. Now, bombastic, irrepressible, and bigger than life, the character strolled through black circuit stage routines like a jovial version of folklore hero John Henry, flashing his infectious smile and outrageous schemes at whoever would like to or listen. Now, although his schemes were seldomly successful, in fact, in most instances, they backfired and ended in total disaster. He was never detoured. It was his indefatigable nature and recourse to an undissipated pool of energy or enthusiasm that braced his comic posture with the underlying note of practical philosophy and realism. For underneath the surface failures, his resoluteness and refusal to be beaten down by the unassailable forces massed against him reflected an abiding belief shared by most African American audiences. Now, his courage and perseverance in the face of defeat, even his whimsical acceptance of that defeat, mirrored Black's determination to press forward even in the most inhospitable circumstances. Now, the city slicker thereby delineates the most prominent characteristic of Black stage comedy. The comedy was almost always reality bound. Prior to the 30s, it adhered fundamentally to circumstances outside the realm of mainstream concern. It represented the humorous extension of Booker T. Washington's maxim, cast down your buckets where you are. Critics would assail that this focus on the down to earth reality of Black life and its resultant comical emphasis on low down and common pursuits. But after all, those parameters were imposed by a society mired in the Jim Crow mentality. As one historian notes, by keeping blacks barred from middle class literate culture America forced them back upon the resources of their folk tradition. Blacks had to develop their artistry and style below mainstream culture standards. The stage comedy of the first half of the 20th century is a rich example of the use of Black folkways. Long after the Depression had practically compelled African Americans to abandon ooh, acquiescent acquiescent relationship to the white world and adopt a more assertive posture when their public humor had begun reflecting the previously concealed discontent. One of the Black stage's most resilient comedians spoke out about the difference between TOBA humor and the more assertive stand-up comics who had taken center stage. Comedy, Pygmy Markham said, is a big field, and there's room enough for everybody. But me, I'm a situational comic, and I never wanted to be anything else. My laughs grow out of the situation, while the stand up gets his out of what he says. But what does he get? Giggles. The situation comic gets a belly laugh every time. Listen to More Sal. Say, and then listen to Red Skelton. Then you'll see what I mean. Man, I could never work for giggles. Now, traditional Black stage humor centered on a broad, body, rambunctious, knock 'em down comedy style that reflected a rough-hewn, blues-saturated African American culture that disregarded the decorum, the restraints, and self-conscious cleverness of mainstream humor. The rush to disavow that traditional humor in the 50s and 60s often placed its practitioners in a defensive position. Pygmy Markham, while acknowledging the effectiveness of later comics who openly attacked American racism, explained the origins of his comic style and asked a penetrating question. I was born and raised Black, he wrote. I learned my comedy from Black comedians. The earliest skits I did on a stage and under a tent were invented by Black men. The audiences I learned to please, all those years in small towns and in big cities, they were mostly Black too. Now, while people aren't turned on to my act at all, they don't dig the slang. They have trouble following my accent. They don't even get the point of some of the jokes. They asked his detractors, who kept our people together in the real bad days so that they could survive long enough to be able to march on Washington later. Now, during those Depression days, when home relief was nothing, when the rats were even huger and hungrier, when the sense of humor was all we had to feed on, Markham's remarks points out the essential nature of the TOBA and the Apollo Theater humor. Its clustered origins and suggests both its underlying historical significance for blacks and the reason it was so popular. Now, by the mid 50s, however, the push towards assimilation and equality and the insistent emphasis on the similarities of black and white culture had nearly rendered the old inbred humor obsolete. But when the walls of segregation began to crumble, the new breed black comic took a turn that shocked many, as if testing the sincerity of mainstream America's grudging relaxation of rigid racist policies. They turned to a more biting humor. The pent up resentment and anger, which had been largely excised from public humor before, was unleashed with scathing monologues by comedians such as Nipsey Russell, Godfrey Cambridge, and most insensibly, Dick Gregory. Now, curiously, this a criminal shit. Let me see what this shit is. A criminous, wit, Acrimonious, a criminous, acrimonious, acrimonious.
Acrimonious.
All right, acrimonious, typically of speech or debate. Curiously, this acrimonious wit took some critics by surprise. For instance, Steve Allen, a notable humorist and usually a perceptive observer of the comedy scene, in his book Funny People, which notes society's reluctant but permit to emergence of witty or intellectual black comedians of the caliber of Bob Hope or Moat Sal before the 60s, Allen goes on to argue that, with few exceptions, blacks had not progressed enough to produce philosophical humorists. What produced the new breed African American comedians was the civil rights. What produced the new breed African American comedians was the civil rights movements, and that, he argues, was accomplished because whites by 1960 had become civilized enough to grant the black man freedom to indulge in biting social commentary. Now, despite the disclaimer, with few exceptions, Allen suggests that stage comedians such as Burt Williams, Alan Drew, Willie Bryant, Miles Mabley, Nipsey Russell, and Red Fox did not exist. In fact, African American humor had a tradition of caustic wit and biting social commentary. It was not created out of whole cloth. The critical and disdainful edge of black humor foreshadowed on the stage by Miles Mabley and openly expressed by the new breed of stand-up comics represented nothing more than a shift in emphasis in the public display of black humor. That edge had been present since slavery. One needed only to drop in at almost any black barbershop, house party, or gut bucket cabaret, or to read black writers from the Harlem Renaissance to the 60s, or to peruse the folk tales, toast, or humorous stories that by the 40s were being collected and anthologized. The emerging humor of the late 50s and 60s was not really new at all. It was simply that when the gate to equal opportunity was cracked just a bit, the truth slipped out. And that was section 3 and the end of chapter 9. We are going to move on later to chapter 10. 10 to get in. I was stumbling. And bumbling over words, but it's all gravy, man. We push through. We push through one word at a time, one page at a time, one section at a time, one chapter at a time, man, until we have moved through our section for the day, which was chapter 9, section 3. They making some headway. They are making some headway. So, but it is what it is, man. It is what it is. We are done for the day. I hope that whoever came through and watched it, got something out of it. If you come back later and check it out, man, we are just African American comedy from slavery to Chris Rock. So, and we're moving on to chapter 10 next. So far so good. So far so good, man. We are making some headway in the book. Headway. We're on the down slope. So hopefully it's something that whoever comes back and looks at this can learn and grow from. Hopefully you can take something from it. But until next time, man, I'll catch you on the back end. Shalom. I hope everybody have a nice night.